The dog had no collar, no shelter, and no reason to stay. Yet for 12 nights he returned to the same front porch and watched a locked door as if someone inside had promised to come home. Rain moved softly across the dark hills outside Asheville, North Carolina, turning the gravel driveway silver beneath the headlights of Ethan Walker's truck. He parked beside the old maple tree and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. The house ahead had belonged to his brother Michael. Now it belonged to silence. Ethan was 37, broad-shouldered, white, and still carried himself like the Marine Staff sergeant he had once been, even after leaving the service. His brown hair was cut short. His faded field jacket smelled faintly of cold air and engine oil. On his left wrist rested an old silver watch Michael had given him years ago. Its hands had stopped at 2:17 and had not moved since. Ethan stepped out into the rain. The porch light was off, but a shape waited beneath the narrow roof. A German shepherd sat beside the door, black and tan coat, soaked dark, ears upright, amber eyes fixed on Ethan. The dog did not bark. He did not rise. He only watched. Ethan stopped halfway up the walk. "You lost, boy." The shepherd's ears shifted toward his voice, but his body remained still. A paper bowl sat near the steps, filled with rainwater and untouched kibble. Someone had tried to feed him. The food had swollen into pale lumps. The dog had not eaten. Ethan climbed the porch carefully and reached for the knob. The shepherd moved then, not toward him, but closer to the threshold. Ethan opened the door. Warm, stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of cedar, dust, and the coffee Michael used to brew too strong. The dog leaned forward until his paws nearly touched the doorway. Then he stopped. "Come inside," Ethan said. The shepherd looked past him into the house. For one long second, Ethan thought he would enter. Instead, the dog sat again. Ethan felt something tighten behind his ribs. He had spent 3 weeks arranging paperwork, speaking to strangers, and listening to people describe Michael in the past tense. None of it had prepared him for the sight of a dog refusing to cross his brother's door. Inside, the house looked almost untouched. Michael's work boots remained beside the coat rack. A folded newspaper rested on the couch. The kitchen clock ticked with patient cruelty. Ethan set his duffel near the stairs and walked toward the table. That was when he saw the envelope. It lay alone beneath the yellow light above the stove, cream-colored, sealed, and marked in Michael's handwriting. For Ethan. Open only when he comes home. Ethan did not touch it at first. He stared at the words until they blurred. His brother had always written slowly, pressing hard enough to leave marks on the page beneath. Ethan placed one hand on the table. The stopped watch on his wrist caught the light. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. The German shepherd remained visible through the glass, sitting in the same place, watching the kitchen. Ethan reached for the envelope. Before his fingers closed around it, the dog stood. Not suddenly, not fearfully. He rose with the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting for exactly that moment. Ethan looked through the window. The shepherd looked back. Then the dog lowered his head toward the letter in Ethan's hand and took one deliberate step toward the door. Ethan kept the envelope in his hand while the German shepherd waited beyond the glass. The rain softened to a fine mist, silver against the porch light he had finally switched on. He should have opened the letter immediately. Instead, he stood in Michael's kitchen and listened to the old refrigerator hum, because delay had become a habit between the brothers. Michael called. Ethan answered later. Michael wrote. Ethan planned to read it when life became quieter. Life never did. 3 weeks earlier, at 2:17 in the morning, Michael's name had appeared on Ethan's phone while he sat alone in temporary quarters outside Camp Lejeune. Ethan had been awake. He remembered that clearly. He had watched the screen glow on the table beside his bunk, listened to the vibration stop, and told himself he would call after sunrise. There had been reports to finish, equipment to return, one final week before discharge. Michael would understand. Michael always understood. By morning, the phone had suffered water damage during a training inspection, and the missed call disappeared beneath a list of other problems. 2 days later, a chaplain found Ethan outside the motor pool. His brother had been taken to Mission Hospital. By the time Ethan reached Asheville, Michael was gone. Ethan had replayed that night until every detail felt sharpened. The dim room, the unanswered screen, the watch on his wrist stopping at the same minute. 2:17. He had wound it, shaken it, taken it to a repair shop near base. Nothing kept it moving. Now the second hand rested between marks as if time itself had refused to continue. Outside, the shepherd raised one paw and placed it carefully on the porch. Ethan looked down at the envelope. Michael's handwriting had once covered birthday cards, grocery lists, and notes taped to the refrigerator. Do not forget Mom's medicine. Call when you land. Proud of you, kid. Michael was 4 years older and had treated that difference like a permanent assignment. When their father left, Michael learned to fix the furnace, stretch a paycheck, and sit through the long nights when their mother's breathing became uncertain. Ethan learned how to leave. First for college, then for the Marine Corps, then for deployments that made distance feel honorable. Michael never criticized him. That made the guilt worse. Ethan broke the seal. The paper inside carried a faint cedar scent from the desk upstairs. He unfolded it once, then again. The first line was simple. Ethan, if you are reading this, then you finally came home. He stopped. The dog outside lowered his head, listening to the sound of paper. Ethan continued. I know you will blame yourself for the call. Do not decide what it meant before you know the whole story. Ethan's throat tightened. The rain whispered against the window. He read the next lines more slowly. There is someone I need you to meet. He has been with me through the worst months, and he knows your scent better than you would believe. His name is Major. Ethan looked toward the porch. The German shepherd stood perfectly still. Major, Ethan said. The dog's ears rose. One step brought him closer to the door. Ethan repeated the name, quieter this time. Major. The shepherd crossed the porch until his nose nearly touched the glass. Then his gaze dropped to Ethan's wrist. To the silver watch stopped at 2:17. A low sound left the dog's chest, not a growl, but something closer to recognition. Ethan opened the door. Major approached the threshold, touched his nose to the watch, and immediately turned toward the dark path behind the house. He walked several yards into the mist, stopped beneath the maple trees, and looked back. He was not leaving. He was asking Ethan to follow. Major waited beneath the maple trees until Ethan stepped off the porch. The path behind the house was narrow and softened by rain, bordered by ferns, wet stones, and the dark trunks of tulip poplars rising into the mist. Ethan followed with Michael's letter folded inside his jacket. The shepherd moved 20 feet ahead, never running, never disappearing from sight. Every few moments, he turned to make sure Ethan was still there. The woods smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and the creek that crossed the lower property. Ethan knew the trail. He and Michael had built it as boys, carrying scrap boards through the brush to make a bridge over the shallow water. Back then, Michael had always crossed first. Ethan had always followed. The memory came quietly now, not like a wound, but like a hand resting on his shoulder. Major left the path near an old split-rail fence and continued downhill. Rainwater gathered along his back, darkening the black saddle of his coat. Ethan called once. Major. The dog stopped, looked over his shoulder, and continued. The silver watch felt heavier against Ethan's wrist. He wondered how many times Michael had walked this same trail with the dog, how many mornings had passed here while Ethan was somewhere else, counting days by schedules and orders. The trees opened near the creek. The old bridge stood ahead, weathered but intact, its boards gray with age. One railing leaned slightly where Ethan had carved their initials nearly 25 years earlier. M and E. Michael had laughed and said the letters would outlast them both. Ethan had forgotten. Major stepped onto the bridge and lowered his nose to the damp boards. He crossed halfway, then stopped beside the leaning rail. There, caught beneath a loose plank, was a faded green cloth. Ethan crouched and pulled it free. It was Michael's scarf, the one he wore every winter, smelling faintly of cedar and rain despite the weeks that had passed. Major sat beside him. Ethan turned the scarf over in his hands. Something small pressed against the fabric. He unfolded one corner and heard metal strike wood. A brass key landed between his boots. Ethan stared at it. The key was no longer than 2 inches, old-fashioned, with a square head darkened by years of use. Major touched it with his nose, then looked toward the house. You brought me out here for this? Ethan asked. The shepherd rose. He walked to the far end of the bridge, paused beside the trail leading back uphill, and waited. Ethan closed his fingers around the key. It was cold, but not unfamiliar. He had seen its shape before on the ring Michael kept above the workbench in the backyard shed. Most of those keys opened ordinary things. Tool cabinets, padlocks, storage bins. But this one had never had a label. Michael had once told him that every family kept one box no one talked about. Ethan had assumed he meant photographs or tax papers. He had not asked. Major started back toward the house. The mist had begun to lift, revealing strips of pale moonlight between the branches. Ethan followed more quickly now. When they reached the yard, the shepherd did not return to the porch. He crossed behind the house and stopped in front of Michael's small wooden shed. The door was locked. Ethan fitted the brass key into the padlock. It turned on the first try. Inside, the air carried the dry scent of sawdust, oil, and old lumber. Major moved past the workbench and stood over one particular floorboard near the back wall. He scratched once, then sat. Ethan knelt and ran his fingers along the edge. The board had been cut cleanly and replaced. Beneath it was a narrow iron handle. Ethan lifted. A hidden compartment opened under the floor. Inside rested a black metal box, a worn dog tag, a small tape recorder, and a second envelope bearing his name. Ethan lifted the black metal box from the compartment and set it on the workbench. Dust rose in a thin cloud around his hands. Major remained beside him, quiet, watching every movement as if he already knew what each object meant. The worn dog tag lay on top of the box. Ethan picked it up first. His name was stamped into the metal, along with a service number he had not seen in years. It had been part of an old set he thought he lost during a move between bases. Michael had kept it. Ethan turned it over and found a strip of faded fabric tied through the chain. The cloth carried a faint scent of cedar and machine oil, unmistakably Michael. Major leaned forward and touched the tag with his nose. Ethan understood then. The dog had not found him by chance. Someone had taught him exactly what to search for. Inside the box were veterinary records, photographs, and a folded training log written in Michael's careful hand. The first photograph showed Michael kneeling beside Major outside a roadside shelter, both of them thinner than they should have been. Another showed the shepherd wearing a plain working harness in the backyard. In the training log, short notes filled each page. Follow scent. Return to porch. Wait at threshold. Stay until invited. Ethan read the last line twice. It did not sound like ordinary obedience training. It sounded like preparation. He opened the second envelope. The paper inside held only 3 paragraphs, and the final sentence stopped halfway across the page. Ethan, Major is not a gift. He is a promise I may not be here to keep. Ethan lowered the letter. The unfinished words unsettled him more than a completed goodbye would have. Michael had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to make plans in secret. Ethan reached for the tape recorder. It was small, scratched along one corner, with a strip of masking tape across the front. On it, Michael had written, "Play after you find the box." Ethan pressed the button. For several seconds, there was only static. Then Michael's voice filled the shed. Older, weaker, still unmistakably his. "Good boy, Major." "Find Ethan." Major's ears lifted. His posture changed at once. He looked toward the recorder, then toward Ethan. Michael's voice continued. "Use the tag. Use the watch. When you find him, do not leave." Ethan gripped the edge of the bench. The watch on his wrist felt cold. In the recording, Michael coughed softly, then resumed. "He will try to send you away. He thinks leaving first hurts less. Do not believe him." Ethan closed his eyes. That was Michael, gentle even when telling the truth. The recording shifted. A chair scraped. Major barked once in the background. Michael laughed, faint but warm. "Stay until he opens the door." The tape clicked off. Rain whispered against the shed roof. Ethan stood motionless, surrounded by proof that his brother had spent his final months preparing for Ethan's loneliness. He had thought the dog was waiting for food, shelter, or someone who would never return. Now he saw the shape of the real task. Major had been sent to find him. More than that, the shepherd had been told to remain until Ethan chose to stop standing outside his own life. Ethan looked toward the house. Its windows glowed dimly through the mist. "You could have come in," he said. Major watched him. "You were waiting for me to ask." The dog did not move. Ethan gathered the photographs and the unfinished letter, but when he reached for the recorder, a faint sound came from within it. The tape had not fully ended. A final piece of Michael's voice broke through the static. "And when he asks about the call at 2:17, tell Sarah he is ready." Sarah Collins lived 4 miles away in a white farmhouse near the edge of town, where a small veterinary clinic occupied the converted barn behind her home. Ethan arrived just after midnight with Major in the passenger seat of his truck and Michael's recorder resting between them. The shepherd had finally crossed the porch threshold only long enough to follow Ethan to the vehicle, then waited beside the open door until Ethan gave a quiet nod. Now he sat upright, watching the road through the rain-streaked windshield. Sarah opened the clinic door before Ethan reached it. She was 35, with dark hair tied loosely behind her neck and the tired, steady eyes of someone who had spent years caring for creatures that could not explain where they hurt. When she saw Major, her expression softened. "You found him," she said. Ethan held up the recorder. "Michael said you would know about the call." Sarah looked toward Major, then back at Ethan. "Come inside." The clinic smelled of clean linen, cedar shavings, and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Major settled near the examination table, but his eyes stayed on Ethan. Sarah poured 2 cups and left one untouched beside him. "Your brother came here often during the last 6 months," she said. "At first for Major. Later, mostly to talk." Ethan looked down at the watch stopped at 2:17. "Was he alone when he called me?" Sarah did not answer immediately. She opened a desk drawer and removed a small memory card in a clear plastic case. "He was already at Mission Hospital." Ethan's head lifted. "Before the call?" "Yes. He had been admitted that afternoon." He knew his heart was failing. The doctors were keeping him comfortable. The room seemed to grow quieter. Ethan had spent 3 weeks believing Michael had called from an empty house, frightened and waiting for help that never came. Sarah placed the card on the table. He did not call because he was in danger. He called because he wanted to say something while he still could. Ethan stared at the small piece of plastic. "Then why did nobody tell me?" "Your phone was damaged. The message never finished uploading to your account. Michael knew that might happen, so he asked me to keep a copy." Major rose and moved closer, stopping just beside Ethan's knee. Sarah inserted the card into a recorder on her desk. "He told me not to play it until you asked about 2:17. Ethan's hand closed around the old watch. "Play it." Michael's voice came through the speaker, thinner than on the tape in the shed, but calm. "Ethan, it is me. You are probably working. You are always working." A soft breath followed, almost a laugh. "Do not be angry with yourself for not answering. I know you. You will try to turn one missed call into a sentence you serve for the rest of your life." Ethan looked away. Rain tapped against the clinic windows. Michael continued. "I did not call for rescue. I called to tell you I was proud of you. I called to tell you there is nothing left between us that needs forgiving." Ethan's chest tightened until breathing felt like lifting weight. Major pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. The message continued. "You always come home for everyone else. This time, come home for yourself. Major knows the way if you forget." The recording paused. Then Michael's voice returned one last time. "And Ethan, do not confuse missing me with losing your way." The speaker clicked into silence. Ethan sat without moving. Sarah did not touch him or offer words too small for the moment. Major lowered his head into Ethan's lap. For years, Ethan had believed strength meant keeping grief contained, folded tightly where no one could see it. But Michael's voice had opened the place he had guarded most. Ethan put one hand against Major's neck and let the silence hold him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He knew I would try to leave again." Sarah nodded. "That is why he trained Major to stay." Ethan looked toward the clinic door. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. "Then I suppose the dog has not finished his assignment." Major lifted his ears. Sarah gave a small, sad smile. "No, I do not think he has." Ethan drove back to Michael's house before dawn, with Major silent beside him and the unopened rest of the night waiting on the road ahead. The rain had stopped, leaving the trees dark and shining under a thin gray sky. When they reached the porch, Major stepped out of the truck and returned to the same place beside the door. Ethan stood with one hand on the knob. "You can come in," he said. The shepherd looked at him, then at the threshold, but did not move. Ethan understood. The invitation had been spoken, but not yet meant. Inside, he placed Michael's recorder on the kitchen table and set the silver watch beside it. 2:17. The hands had not shifted. He walked through each room, opening drawers, folding shirts, collecting small pieces of a life that had continued without him. A grocery receipt, a half-finished book, a coffee mug with a chipped handle. On the mantel stood a photograph of the brothers at 12 and 16, muddy from the creek and grinning as if the world had no ending. Ethan turned the frame face down. By noon, The grief had hardened into something practical. He called a real estate agent. He packed 2 boxes for donation. He told himself that staying would not change anything. Michael was gone. Major needed a stable home, not a man who still woke at every sound and carried an entire conversation he could never finish. That afternoon, Ethan drove the shepherd to a foster family Sarah trusted outside Black Mountain. The couple had a fenced yard, 2 older dogs, and kind voices. Major stood beside Ethan as they discussed feeding schedules and veterinary records. He did not resist when the new leash changed hands. That made it worse. Ethan crouched and touched the torn edge of the dog's right ear. "You did what he asked," he said. "You found me." Major held his gaze. "You are done now." The shepherd did not move. Ethan stood before his voice could fail and walked to the truck without looking back. The house felt colder when he returned. Evening settled over the hills, and wind moved softly through the porch boards. Ethan packed until darkness filled the windows. He found Michael's unfinished second letter beneath the recorder and read the first line again. "Major is not a gift. He is a promise I may not be here to keep." Ethan folded it quickly and placed it in a box. At 9:30, his phone rang. Sarah's name lit the screen. "Major is gone," she said. Ethan stood still. The fence. Closed. Gate latched. He waited until the family went inside, then found another way out. Ethan was already reaching for his jacket. How long? Maybe 40 minutes. The road to Black Mountain blurred beneath his headlights. Ethan searched the shoulder, the wooded turns, the small gas station near the highway. No dog. No shadow moving through the trees. He called Major's name until his throat hurt. Near midnight, he stopped at Michael's grave. He did not know why. Maybe because there were no other places left to look. The cemetery rested on a low hill above town, rows of pale stones shining beneath the moon. Ethan left the truck and walked through wet grass. At first, he saw only the empty bench near the maple tree. Then a dark shape moved beside Michael's headstone. Major sat there, soaked from the creek and breathing hard, but steady. He had traveled miles through unfamiliar roads to return to the one person he had not been ready to leave. Ethan stopped several feet away. "You were supposed to stay," he said. Major lowered his head. The words broke inside Ethan before he could hold them together. He knelt in the grass and covered his face with both hands. For the first time since the chaplain found him at the motor pool, he let the grief come without discipline, without silence, without trying to deserve it. Major crossed the space between them and rested his head against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan held the dog close. No answer came from the grave. No sign moved in the sky. There was only the warmth of a living creature refusing to leave. Ethan pressed his forehead against Major's wet fur. "All right," he whispered. "You can stay." Ethan brought Major home just before sunrise. The hills were beginning to turn blue behind the trees, and a faint line of gold rested above the eastern ridge. Neither of them moved quickly. Major was tired from the miles he had crossed, and Ethan felt as though the night had taken something heavy from him and left the space open. When they reached the porch, the shepherd climbed the steps and stopped at the same threshold where he had waited for 12 nights. Ethan unlocked the door. Warm air from the kitchen touched the dog's face. Major looked inside, then back at Ethan. The choice still belonged to him. Ethan removed his wet jacket and stood beside the doorway. "You kept your promise," he said. His voice was quiet, but steady. "Now let me keep mine." Major's ears shifted forward. Ethan opened the door wider. "Come inside." For one long second, the shepherd did not move. Then he lifted one paw over the threshold, followed with the other, and entered the house without looking back. The sound of his nails against the hardwood was small, almost ordinary, yet it changed the whole room. Major walked through the kitchen, paused beside Michael's chair, and lowered his head toward the empty seat. Ethan watched from the doorway. The dog did not whine. He simply stood there, as if offering a final report to someone who had once waited for him in that same place. Ethan set the recorder on the table and placed Michael's unfinished letter beside it. The silver watch remained where he had left it, its hands fixed at 2:17. He picked it up and turned it over in his palm. The back was scratched, the leather band worn soft from years of use. Michael had given it to him on the morning Ethan left for boot camp. "Keep track of where you are," he had said. Not just the time. Ethan sat in Michael's chair and played the voicemail again. This time, he did not stop at halfway. He listened through every breath, every pause, every word his brother had left behind. When the message ended, Ethan remained still. Major came to his side and rested his head beneath Ethan's hand. The house held the silence differently now. It no longer felt empty. It felt honest. Later that morning, Ethan drove into Asheville and found a small watch repair shop near Pack Square. The owner, an older man with silver glasses, opened the case and studied the mechanism beneath a bright lamp. "Nothing serious," he said. "One gear is stuck. Could have happened from moisture or impact." He adjusted a wheel no larger than a fingernail, cleaned the movement, and wound the crown. The second hand trembled. Then it moved. One mark. Two. Three. Ethan stared at it. There was no flash of light. No impossible sign. Only a tiny piece of metal releasing what had held it still. The watchmaker smiled. "Sometimes things stop because they have been carrying too much pressure." Ethan fastened the watch around his wrist. The hands passed 2:17 and continued. When he returned home, Major was waiting inside the doorway, not outside it. Ethan placed Michael's second letter on the table and finished reading the final unfinished line. "Major is not a gift. He is a promise I may not be here to keep, but maybe he can help you keep yours." Ethan looked toward the shepherd. "I think he already has." Major walked over and lay at his feet. For the first time since returning, Ethan did not pack a box, make a plan to leave, or turn a photograph face down. He opened the curtains. Morning light entered the room, and the old house, patient through all those silent weeks, finally looked like a place someone had come home to. 6 months passed, and the house changed slowly, the way wounded things often do. Ethan repaired the loose porch boards, painted the kitchen walls, and cleared the shed without throwing away the tools Michael had arranged by hand. Major followed him through each task, settling nearby with the patient attention of a supervisor who never needed to speak. The silver watch kept steady time on Ethan's wrist. Every morning, it moved past 2:17 without stopping. Ethan still noticed. He simply no longer held his breath. By early spring, Sarah introduced him to a local support program for veterans and their families. The meetings were held in a renovated community center outside Asheville, where folding chairs formed a quiet circle beneath warm ceiling lights. Ethan resisted at first. He had spent most of his life believing private pain should remain private. Major made the decision easier. The shepherd walked into the room, chose a place beside an older veteran named Frank, and rested his head across the man's boots. Frank had not spoken during his first 3 meetings. That afternoon, he looked down at Major and whispered, "You miss somebody too?" Major stayed still. Frank began to talk. After that, Ethan returned every Thursday. He never called himself a counselor. He made coffee, repaired broken chairs, and listened when someone needed the room to remain quiet. Major seemed to understand who needed him most. He sat beside widows who twisted wedding rings around their fingers. He leaned against children who waited for parents still deployed overseas. He rested beneath the table when words became too difficult. Ethan watched and learned that helping did not always require orders or answers. Sometimes it meant staying long enough for another person to believe they were not alone. At home, he stopped packing boxes. He contacted the real estate agent and withdrew the listing. Michael's photographs returned to the mantel, including the one Ethan had once turned face down. He framed the unfinished letter and placed it beside the old tape recorder, not as a shrine, but as proof that some promises could continue after the person who made them was gone. On the porch, Ethan repaired Michael's wooden chair and built another beside it. Most evenings, he sat in one while Major rested between them. The second chair remained empty. At first, Ethan avoided looking at it. Later, he began setting his coffee on its armrest, the way Michael had done during long summer conversations. The emptiness stopped feeling like an accusation. It became a place where memory could sit without taking over the whole house. One Thursday evening, after a meeting at the community center, a young Marine named Luke remained behind. He was 28, recently discharged, and carried the stiff posture of someone still waiting for the next command. Major crossed the room and sat in front of him. Luke looked at Ethan. Does he always know? Ethan glanced at the worn training tag beneath Major's collar. Not everything, he said. Just when someone is trying too hard to stand alone. Luke lowered his eyes. Major placed one paw over his boot. The room stayed quiet until Luke began speaking about the brother he had lost overseas. Ethan listened without interrupting. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows, the same gentle sound that had filled Michael's house on the night Ethan came home. This time, it did not call him backward. It reminded him how far he had come. When Ethan and Major returned home, the porch light was glowing beneath the eaves. Major climbed the steps, then paused beside the empty chair. He looked at it for several seconds, ears relaxed, before turning toward the door. Ethan waited with his hand on the knob. Major did this every night now. Not from confusion. Not because he expected Michael to appear. It was simply the way he remembered. Ethan opened the door. "Come on, partner." Major stepped inside, and Ethan followed, leaving the porch light on behind them. By the following fall, the maple trees above Michael's house had turned copper and gold, and the porch steps carried the faint scent of rain-soaked leaves. Ethan no longer measured his days by what he had failed to do. He measured them by smaller things. Coffee before sunrise. Major's pause crossing the kitchen floor. Thursday meetings at the community center. Letters answered instead of postponed. The house remained Michael's in quiet ways, but it had also become Ethan's home. One Sunday afternoon, Sarah arrived with a cardboard box from the clinic storage room. Inside were Major's earliest records, a worn red leash, and one final photograph Michael had never placed in the metal box. It showed him seated on the porch beside Major, both facing the empty chair across from them. On the back, Michael had written a single line. "He will wait as long as you need, but do not make him wait forever." Ethan read it while Major rested against his knee. The words no longer felt like a warning. They felt like permission. That evening, Ethan carried the second chair from the porch into the shed. For 6 months, it had stood as a place for memory, and memory had needed it. But grief had changed. It no longer required an empty seat at every meal, every sunset, every quiet hour. Ethan sanded the wood, tightened the loose joints, and brought it to the community center the next morning. He placed it beside the circle of folding chairs. Frank sat there first, then Luke. Later, a young widow named Hannah used it while Major rested at her feet. No one knew whose chair it had been. They only knew someone always seemed to choose it when speaking became difficult. Ethan never explained. Some things did not need to be named to keep serving their purpose. Winter returned gently to the mountains. On the anniversary of Michael's passing, Ethan drove to the cemetery with Major beside him. Snow dusted the grass in thin white lines, and the air smelled of pine and distant wood smoke. Ethan stood before the headstone while Major sat close against his leg. He did not bring flowers. He brought the old silver watch. For months, it had kept perfect time, but that morning Ethan removed it and placed it briefly against the stone. "I am still here," he said. The words were simple. They were enough. Major lowered his head near the grave, then looked toward Ethan. There was no need to remain longer. Ethan fastened the watch back around his wrist, and together they walked down the hill. That night, rain tapped softly against the porch roof. Major paused beside the place where the empty chair had once stood. He looked at the bare boards for a moment, then turned toward the open door. Ethan waited inside. "You ready?" Major stepped across the threshold without hesitation. The shepherd crossed the kitchen and settled near the fire, while Ethan placed Michael's final photograph beside the unfinished letter. The clock on the wall moved past 2:17. Nothing stopped. Nothing broke. Ethan sat in the chair across from Major and listened to the house breathe around them. He understood now that coming home had never meant returning to the life he had before. It meant choosing to remain inside the life still waiting for him. Michael had left a letter. He had left a dog. But more than that, he had left Ethan a way back. Some people say goodbye with words. Others leave behind someone patient enough to wait until the door finally opens.